My girlfriend keeps praising her ex, and even told me to learn from him, but then I did what I had to do. I met Emily at Mark's summer party. It was one of those humid evenings where the air felt thick, but somehow it didn't matter because everything else was perfect. She stood out the moment I walked in. She had this laugh that could make a room pause, and when she talked about her hiking trips, I couldn't help but join the conversation. Within an hour, we realized how much we had in common. Travel, hiking, trying out hole-in-the-wall restaurants, it felt like meeting someone who had been living a parallel life to mine. We started dating almost immediately. Those first months were like something out of a movie. We explored local trails, found hidden gems in the city for date nights, and even took a weekend road trip to the mountains. My friends adored her. My mom said she was a perfect match and couldn't stop commenting on how well we complemented each other. Emily had this natural charisma that made people feel at ease around her. I couldn't believe my luck. But then, about 7 months in, little things started to surface. It began with casual mentions of her ex, Jason. At first, it was harmless. Jason used to make the best guacamole, or, Jason always knew the fastest routes when we traveled. I didn't think much of it. Everyone has a past, right? But over time, the mentions became more frequent. She would drop his name when we were watching a movie, eating out, or even planning trips. It was like he was some invisible third wheel in our relationship. I decided to bring it up one evening after she'd mentioned how Jason knew how to fix anything around the house. I told her, as calmly as I could, that it didn't feel great being compared to her ex. She seemed surprised at first and apologized. She promised she'd be more mindful and said it was just a habit, not something meant to hurt me. I wanted to believe her. I really did. For a while, things got better. She stopped mentioning him, and I thought we were back on track. But it didn't last. Slowly, his name crept back into conversations. This time, it wasn't just casual remarks. She'd compare specific things I did to how Jason would have done them. Jason always used to plan surprises, or, Jason would have known what to do in this situation. It wasn't outright mean, but the comparison started to weigh on me. I began to feel like I was constantly being measured against someone who wasn't even there anymore. The tipping point came one night after a dinner party. We'd been talking with friends about relationship dynamics when Emily, half-jokingly, suggested that I should learn a few things from Jason if I wanted to be the ideal partner. She said it with a laugh, but the sting was sharp and immediate. I tried to brush it off in front of everyone, but inside, I was fuming. Later that night, I told her how much it had hurt to hear that. She seemed genuinely sorry, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was off. That moment marked a shift for me. I started noticing how often I was holding back my feelings to keep the peace. Emily, for all her charm and warmth, seemed to carry Jason's shadow into every corner of our relationship. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I was ever going to be enough for her. As time went on, Emily's habit of bringing up Jason in conversations grew worse, and it began spilling into moments with our friends. One evening, we were out for dinner with a small group, and the topic of holiday traditions came up. Without hesitation, Emily launched into a story about how Jason had once planned a surprise Christmas getaway. She turned to me with a casual smile and suggested I could learn a thing or two from him. The laughter around the table felt like a dagger. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was unraveling. Why couldn't she just let the past stay where it belonged? Things escalated further a few weeks later. We were sitting on the couch, watching TV, when Emily started reminiscing about how Jason had ended their relationship. She said it with an odd sense of admiration, explaining how he'd told her he had grown beyond what they had together and needed to move on for his own growth. I couldn't believe she was talking about her ex with such reverence, as though he were some sage figure instead of a guy who'd left her behind. It struck me then that she wasn't over him. Not really. She'd moved forward physically, but emotionally, Jason still held a piece of her. That realization stayed with me, and I started to see our relationship differently. I'd spent so much time trying to meet Emily's expectations, to be the partner she needed, that I hadn't stopped to think about whether she was doing the same for me. Slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. If Jason had set such a high bar with his perfect breakup, maybe that was what Emily needed to finally let go. Maybe I needed to mirror his approach, to show her what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone growing beyond a relationship. But to do that, I had to tread carefully. Any sudden moves might give her the upper hand, and I couldn't let that happen. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior only reinforced my decision. At Mark's engagement party, she found a way to make the entire night uncomfortable for me. Over champagne and small talk, she recounted how Jason had proposed to his new girlfriend in some grand, romantic gesture. "That's how it's done," she said with a playful nudge in my direction, as though it were a harmless joke. I could feel the eyes of everyone around us. Some laughed nervously, while others avoided looking at me altogether. I wanted to say something, to call her out on how disrespectful she was being, but I held my tongue. Confronting her now would ruin Mark's night, and I refused to stoop to her level in front of our friends. That night solidified my resolve. Emily needed to understand what it felt like to be on the other side of her comparisons, her endless invocations of Jason's supposed perfection. I began to pull back in small, subtle ways. I kept our routines intact but started withholding the emotional investment I'd poured into the relationship. I didn't stop making dinner or helping around the apartment, but my enthusiasm faded. I became deliberate about creating distance, both physically and emotionally, while ensuring Emily wouldn't notice right away. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. I still smiled when I needed to, still laughed at her jokes, but behind the facade, I was charting a path toward what I believed had to be done. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Emily's fixation on Jason wasn't just a quirk or a harmless habit. It was a chain that held her back, and by extension, it held us back. If she couldn't let go of him, then I had to show her why she needed to. And if that meant stepping away entirely, then so be it. By the end of that week, I knew what my next steps would be. Emily had made it clear she valued Jason's legacy more than the reality of what we had. Now, it was my turn to take control of the narrative. The perfect breakup she'd romanticized would soon become her reality. The plan was simple, but executing it required precision. I started by booking a reservation at Emily's favorite restaurant, the one we always went to for special occasions. She loved its intimate ambience, the way the candles flickered against the rustic walls, and how the servers always greeted her by name. It was the perfect stage for what I had in mind. That evening, I dressed in a way I knew would strike a chord with her. She'd once mentioned how Jason's style was always effortlessly sophisticated, and I'd picked out a tailored jacket and shirt that I'd seen him wear in one of her old photos. The irony of the choice wasn't lost on me, but it fit the narrative I was about to create. Emily was in a great mood when we arrived. She'd recently been promoted at work and couldn't stop talking about the exciting projects she was going to lead. Her excitement was infectious, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt for what I was about to do. But then she started reminiscing about how Jason had celebrated her last promotion, throwing her a surprise party with all her friends. She laughed as she recounted the details, completely oblivious to how I stiffened beside her. It was yet another reminder of why this had to happen. As we ordered our food, I kept the conversation light. I let her talk about her plans and dreams, nodding in all the right places, even managing a few genuine smiles. Inside, though, I was rehearsing my lines, making sure every word would land exactly as intended. This wasn't just a breakup, it was a performance, one designed to make Emily see what she'd been blind to all along. When the main courses arrived, I decided it was time. I set down my fork, took a deep breath, and started speaking. I told her how much I'd valued our time together, how she'd taught me things about myself I hadn't known before. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion, her smile faltering slightly. Then, I said the words I'd practiced over and over, "I think I've outgrown what we have. I need to move on to become the person I'm meant to be." The shock on her face was immediate. She sat back in her chair, her eyes wide as she tried to process what I'd just said. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, the questions started. What did I mean? Was this because of something she'd done? Had I met someone else? I stayed calm, answering each question with the same measured tone. No, it wasn't her fault. No, there was no one else. This was about me, about my journey, about becoming my best self. As the reality of my words sank in, her emotions spilled out in waves. First came the disbelief, then the tears. She tried to argue, to convince me that we could work through whatever it was I was feeling. But I held firm, repeating variations of the lines she'd once praised Jason for using. With each word, I saw her defenses crumble. The irony was cruel, but it was also fitting. She'd put Jason on a pedestal for doing this to her, and now she was experiencing it from the other side. Eventually, the tears gave way to anger. She accused me of being selfish, of blindsiding her when things were going so well. I let her vent, absorbing her words without reacting. I'd prepared for this, knowing it was a necessary part of the process. But even as she lashed out, I could see the underlying pain in her eyes. It wasn't just about losing me, it was about losing the illusion she'd created of what our relationship could be. When she finally ran out of words, there was a long silence. She looked at me, searching for something, a sign that I might change my mind, that this wasn't real. But I stayed resolute, my expression calm and unyielding. After what felt like an eternity, she stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. I sat there for a while, finishing my drink as the weight of what I'd done settled over me. The restaurant's familiar warmth felt hollow now, the flickering candles casting shadows that seemed darker than before. I knew I'd achieved what I'd set out to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. Emily had wanted the perfect breakup, and I'd given it to her. But in doing so, I'd also closed the door on a chapter of my life that I'd once believed would last forever. Breaking up with Emily didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Instead, it opened a floodgate of chaos. At first, it was just the texts. Long messages where she swung between pleading and accusing, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored them, thinking she'd eventually tire out, but then she started showing up near my apartment. She'd wait outside, pretending to run into me on my way to work or when I went out for groceries. Her excuses for being there were flimsy, but her intent was clear. She wanted to talk, to fix things, or at least try to. Things escalated when Mark invited me to a small gathering at his place. I hesitated to go, knowing there was a chance Emily might be there, but Mark assured me it was a low-key event, and he hadn't invited her. Still, when I arrived, something felt off. The atmosphere was too calculated, the guests too few. Then Emily appeared, holding a stack of printed slides. She'd orchestrated an entire presentation about why we should give our relationship another chance. She launched into her intervention, detailing every moment she thought we'd been happy together. The room was silent, the tension suffocating. I'd prepared for something like this, though. I pulled out my phone, played back a voice memo of her praising Jason and comparing him to me in front of our friends. The contrast between her words then and her claims now was undeniable. Her face fell, and the room's silence turned into murmurs of discomfort. She stormed out in tears, leaving everyone behind in awkward disbelief. For a while, I thought that might be the end of it. But Emily wasn't done. A week later, I got a call from her sister Lily. She invited me to lunch, making it sound casual, but it quickly became clear she'd been roped into Emily's plans. The restaurant Emily had chosen wasn't random either, it was where we'd first met. The moment I walked in, I saw Emily sitting at a corner table, nervously adjusting the place settings. Lily tried to make light of it, but I could see the guilt on her face. I turned around and walked out without a word. Emily's persistence didn't end there. A few days later, she tried another tactic. This time, she coordinated with Lily to arrange a chance encounter at a park where I often went for a run. As I rounded a corner, there she was, pretending to read on a bench. I kept jogging, pretending not to notice, but I could feel her eyes following me. Her determination was relentless, and it was wearing me down. The breaking point came when she showed up at my gym. It was a place I'd considered a sanctuary, a space where I could clear my head and escape the drama. Seeing her there, waiting near the lockers, was the final straw. My patience, already thin, was stretched to its limit. I knew I couldn't keep avoiding her forever, but confronting her here, in a place that was supposed to be mine, felt like an invasion I couldn't ignore. As I approached the locker area, I saw her standing there, shifting nervously. The sight of her in this space, my sanctuary, ignited a mix of anger and exhaustion. This had gone far enough. I walked up to her and, without raising my voice, made my stance clear. Her behavior had crossed every boundary, and it needed to stop. The people around us began to notice, their conversations fading into an awkward silence as they watched the scene unfold. I didn't shy away from the audience, in fact, I used it to drive my point home. I explained how her actions were not only inappropriate but could also have legal consequences. I emphasized that if she continued, would have no choice but to seek a restraining order. Emily's expression shifted through a series of emotions. First, there was shock, as though she hadn't fully grasped the impact of her behavior until that moment. Then came a flicker of anger, quickly replaced by a deep, unsettling sadness. For the first time, it seemed like she was truly processing the gravity of her actions and how they appeared to everyone else. After a long pause, she finally turned and left without saying a word. The gym's usual hum of activity resumed, but I stood there for a moment, letting the tension drain from my body. It was over, at least for now. The weeks that followed felt like a slow return to normalcy. Emily stopped reaching out, and her presence vanished from the places she'd once tried to infiltrate. I kept a record of every incident, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how important it was to trust my instincts and establish boundaries. Life moved on. I began dating again, but this time with a sharper sense of awareness. I paid close attention to how potential partners talked about their pasts, looking for any signs of unresolved baggage or comparisons that might hint at trouble down the line. It wasn't about being overly cautious, it was about protecting myself from repeating the same mistakes. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Emily through mutual friends. She'd apparently started seeing a therapist and had joined some kind of personal growth workshop. Whether it was genuine self-improvement or just another phase, I couldn't say, but I hoped she'd find the clarity she needed. Not for my sake, but for hers. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized the breakup had taught me something invaluable. Sometimes, the only way to help someone see their own toxicity is to hold up a mirror and let them confront it themselves. It's not an easy process, and it's not always met with gratitude, but it's necessary. In the end, Emily's behavior forced me to reevaluate my own choices and priorities, and for that, I was oddly grateful. Now, I focus on building connections that are grounded in mutual respect and understanding. I've learned to speak up when something feels off and to walk away when boundaries are crossed. Life isn't perfect, but it feels lighter, like a chapter that finally reached its conclusion, leaving room for new beginnings.